Hello everyone, good evening and welcome back to the channel. So we are starting on the first video of discussion wherein we go into the details of Spring Boot internal workings, and today's session we are going to focus specifically on one property which is called as server.port. So when we are starting with this particular property, why? Because it's very important how you configure this particular property and what is the use case that you are currently dealing with. Okay, so let's say you have an application that you are deploying on your laptop. Okay, so at a time that application will work with only one instance of that application will work because there will be a port that will be configured for your application. With Spring Boot, the default value or the way that we configured the port is by a property called server.port. Now, in some cases, you might not see this property present in your application properties or configuration because this property also has a default value, and the default value is 8080. So in case you are not able to see this property in your microservice, in an existing microservice, or when you download the microservice from Spring Initializer, that is because it is using the default port which Spring Boot has configured for us, which is server.port value as 8080. Now, when we discuss the server.port is a configuration, that means we can actually configure it for different microservices as per our needs. So coming back to our use case, so let's say you have a login microservice of your application and you are currently running that microservice on your laptop, and the default port is 8080. Now you create a second microservice which is maybe the display or the main screen of your application. Again, when you create a Spring Boot microservice, it is going to ship in with the default configuration, and when you try to start that particular application where login microservice is already running, the main application which has your content data is not going to start. It is going to say that the server.port server that the port 8080 is already in use. Okay, so in such cases also it's important that you decide which exactly which microservice is going to run on which port. Now this was one use case. Second use case, let's say if you want to actually deploy multiple instances of your login server or login microservice on a single server. So for example, depending on the capacity, if you have a server which has 10 GBs of RAM and your login microservice only needs 500 MB, so you can scale up your login microservice by installing multiple instances of the same microservice on the same server. In this case, again, the issue will be if all the microservices try to start on the same port, only one microservice will be started, and you will again end up with the same situation. So there, over there, we can actually configure the server.port between all the set of microservices. Basically, in our case, login microservice to use different ports randomly. This is something that we are going to see in this lecture also. So starting with our discussion, we just saw that the default value of this particular configuration is 8080. The way to change this property, the change this port will be make use of server.port in your application.properties or server colon port colon some value in your application.yaml. This we can also supply as a argument, VM argument, when we try to start up your application, which is java minus d server.port equal to some value and your jar. Now, more on the VM arguments and different ways of running the Spring Boot microservices from the CLI we will see in the upcoming videos. Currently focusing on the server.port property, we all know that the port values can start from 0 and can go up to 65535, which is 2 raised to the power 16 minus 1. 2 raised to the power 16 is 65536. Now we just saw that the default port was 8080. So whenever you are trying to use or deploy Spring Boot microservices when they are supposed to use HTTP, try to use the port 8080, which is again default configured. But let's say you have HTTPS, then we should go for using a port 8443. Moving ahead, so let me just try to show you the application. So for example, if I don't give any value for this property and I'm going to start up my application, This is my Spring Boot internals project. I just created it for the video. The content of this Spring Boot internals project is available on GitHub. I will be providing the link of the project, GitHub link of the project in the description section of this particular video. Going ahead, I commented the server.port property. Actually, when you see that the application still restart, and it was started at port number 8080, and the port was HTTP. Okay, so the default port for a Spring Boot microservice with HTTP is 8080. Now let's go to the next point where you will start to understand how and much details and what are the different things that you can actually do with this property, and why have we picked up it as the first topic of our playlist. So coming to the port value, so we saw that the ports can range from 0 to 65535. But what will happen if I make the server.port value as 0? So in this case, what happens is, before going there, let me just try to show you what happens when I say server.port as 1000, and if I try to start up my application, it says Tomcat started on port 1000 with context path empty. So it is taking up the property that we provided in application.properties. Now we are under the discussion wherein we are making this property as 0. Okay, so now let's see the magic. So it started the application on 2968. Okay, now the application is already running. Okay, there is one instance that is already running with the PID of 23924. What happens if I again click on start my application? Now the PID is 111144 and the port number is 2972. So the previous one was 2968. Now we have 2972. Let me start another instance. It started on 2979. So now I have three instances of this particular microservice running at three different ports. Okay, what happens if I am not giving this value? I'm just defaulting it to some value which is 1001. So first time the application starts on port 1001. Currently, if you see, let me terminate the other application as well, 2972 and 2979. 1001 2972, everything else should be terminated. So there is only one application that is running with the PID of 35024 and the port is 1001. Now if I again try to start an application with the same configuration, so here you see the description: web server failed to start, port 1001 was already in use. Identify and stop the process that's listening on port 1001 or configure the application to listen to another port. This is the reason why we need such sort of properties where you can actually configure the property differently for different microservices and deploy multiple instances of a same microservice in a single host, wherein all the microservices will be working with different ports. Now some of you might ask, how will you control these ports? Okay, so for example, let's go back to the previous scenario where we have this random port generation. Okay, so we understood that whenever we set server.port equal to 0, Spring Boot application is going to start up on a completely random port. Okay, now it starts on 3004. If I again try to start up my application, it is going to start on 3007. So it is choosing this random ports. Okay, and this will go on, and I can scale this microservices or multiple instances of this microservices depending on the requirement of my system. This is one part of the solution. Now someone will say that whenever I try to access, for example, www.facebook.com, it is present on a particular server. On that server, there will be one application that will be running on port 8080, and that is how I'm getting the service. But what happens with Spring Boot and microservices is that you have multiple microservices that are entirely forming your ecosystem, and all these microservices become the backend of your application, and they have different ways of communicating with one another. So you may be deploying your microservices in a containerized architecture, or you may be deploying them all of them in a single host and then replicating multiple hosts. So there can be different sort of deployment strategy that you are using. Now coming back, taking the same example to our microservices, to our discussion that we are having over here. So if I want to scale this microservice to multiple instances, I can just say server.port equal to 0, and it will keep on deploying new microservices with different ports, and I'll not see an issue that my particular port is already in use. But also there is a drawback to this. How will I as a customer know on which particular port the microservice is running, right? So in such situation, what happens is there is a service registry. We'll also look at the Eureka service registry and what is the need of service registry and service clients, how it works in a later on video. But try to understand it like this, that there is a registrar who is going to register all the microservices that are present in your application, in your ecosystem. So all the microservice will try to register themselves as a client to the registrar, and he will know this particular microservice has a registry which maintains which microservice is running at which particular port. So if you have login microservice running at three different ports or two different ports, the service registry server will know that login service is available internally to work with two different ports. Okay, so this is how, even though you can have an application starting at random ports, you can still deal with it because it's something internal. You can register all these microservices to a service registry, and whenever another microservice wants to hit the Spring Boot internals API or your login microservice, it can just look up the URL as well as the port from service registries register, and it can access the microservice. Now this also solves the problem only partially, right? Someone might ask that this is going to choose my application port randomly, right? What if it again tries to start up on the port on which my Eureka server or my service registry server is running? So that is also a problem, right? In such situation, there is a configuration that you can do. Okay, I'll just show you the configuration. First of all, we will stop the microservices that are running. Okay, so you use the configuration. Let's say I want my application to have port numbers from 5001 to 5002. So the last number that I'm using over here is 5003. It is not inclusive of this particular set. So the two ports that I'm allowing my microservice to have is 5001 and 5002. 5003 is not inclusive in this particular set. So let's see what happens when I try to run my application like this. Okay, I did a mistake there. Okay, sorted. Now the application did start on 5002 port. Okay, currently there is no other application that is running. Let's see, we deploy another application. Okay, for the same microservice. Where does it start? It starts on port 5001. Okay, now both the ports are utilized. Do you think it will go to 5003? No. It will again try to start the application and it fails. It says failed, web server failed to start, port 5000 was already in use, identify the process and stop it. So this is an error that we already see, but again you see now it is taking the port 5001. Well, if we retry it, it again used port 5001, again used port 5001, 5002. So you see it's internally switching and trying to start the application on one of the ports that it can select from this particular list. Okay, and again I'm mentioning that port 5003 is not inclusive of this particular list. So with this way you can actually specify a range of ports which your microservice can take, and this will be a pre-configured range of ports. So for example, if you can scale the microservices to, let's say, 10 instances, so what you can do is you can say that the number of ports that I can use is 5001 to 5011, where 5011 is the maximum port number. All the ports have to be below that. So currently it's scaled a microservice with 5004. In this way you can have random ports assigned to the same microservices in the same ecosystem, and also control the number of instances that will be there. Moreover, you can also control the port that is getting allocated. So this is one of the advantages of using the server.port property, as well as you can predict the number of you can basically predict the number of port that this particular microservice is going to use till some extent. You're not giving it an infinite value to choose from between 065535. I'm saying infinite because for that particular range it can choose anything and it will be very difficult for me to guess. But when I'm restricting it to choose from these values, I can still manage it and probably guess when there are less number of ports that are available, that the next application will be started on this port or this port. So we just saw the server.port property wherein default value was 8080. We saw how the server.port property behaves when we set the port value to 0, wherein it starts with a random port every time you try to start the application. This is good from the point of view that you don't need to really start the application on random ports on your application host or maybe in production environment. It can take care of getting a new random port number from a list of ports. The range of port will be from 0 to 65535. And next, wherein we might encounter issues wherein an actual service is running on a port and the Spring Boot microservice tries to start on the same port, we can restrict the port that it can choose from a particular set. Next, we saw that we have a range defined from 0 to 65535. Now let's try to experiment with it and let's try to play with it a bit. So I have now set the server.port value to -1. Okay, so you'll see what happens is the application will still start. The possible ports that you can assign to a service or a service can use is from 0 to 65535. But Spring Boot, what we have done is we can also start the application on -1, and it did initialize the web application context. So your web application context is initialized, but you will not be able to access the application over HTTP. So you basically your REST services will not work. Now let's go to one step further. What if I try to start the application on server.port -2? It again started my application, but it started my application on port -1. Okay, this is interesting. Now let's see something else. Maybe let's see 1001 value. What happens then? Again, it started my application on port -1. Now let's play with it a little. So we know that the highest possible value of the port is this. Let's increment it by 1 and let's negate the value. Now let's see. So we are kind of faltering with two issues here. We are going to the maximum value of the ports in negative side, and we are going to see how it will behave and what it will respond us. Again, the application is started at -1 port. Okay, so this is another important lesson, that if you want to basically deploy this particular microservice as an internal microservice and don't want the HTTP services to be accessible, but you want the AGP services to be available, in this case you can define the server.port to a negative value. It will not it will initialize the web application context, but it will not be in use. The HTTP calls will not work. So this is another use case that you can do with the application with the same property server.port. Now going ahead with the last use case, wherein we are faltering with the last particular value of sports, which is 65535. Now let's see and deploy the application. It was able to start on 65535. Now let's go one port more. Okay, let's go on 65536. As soon as we go to 65536, it is going to start complaining to us. Okay, so it says failed to start bean web server start stop. Okay, unable to start embedded Tomcat server. What else does it say? Protocol handler start failed. Port out of range 65536. So it is clearly telling us that it was not able to start. This was the bean which does the startup. And why? Because it was the port that we specified was out of range. Okay, so this is another important thing to remember about this particular property. Okay, now going ahead, I'll just quickly show you. If we try to, so this is my uh, java -d server.port. Here I'm trying to run the jar. I'm specifying the server.port as 2022. Remember, the server.port that I've configured at my application side is 65536, and the application startup failed. Okay, I'll show you what happens now. So the Tomcat started on port 2022. So the property that was present over here was overridden by the property that we gave at the command line. We are going to see more about this command line and different arguments from time to time. But for the current session, our main focus was to use this server.port, play around with it, try to configure it to different values, try to understand the different use cases that we can try to this particular value, and see what we can at max learn from this. Okay, so I'll quickly go to the ppt. We saw the server.port. It is going to when we set it to 0 value, it generates the random ports, and it can still be discovered with the help of service registry. Eureka service is something that we are going to see. Then we saw this expression wherein you can set the port numbers via range, so 100 to 102. It only includes 100 and 101 port. Then we saw what happens when we set the port as -1. The application does start up. What happens when we set the server.port value to -2? Again, the application starts, but it starts at port -1. We saw what happens with -65536. The value is important because the number of ports that are permissible is 65535, and we are doing the negative of that particular value. But the application does start again on port -1. And finally, we are saying that for port -1 can be used to switch off the HTTP endpoints and but still create the web application context. It can be used sometimes useful for testing. And finally, we are testing the application with the value of 65536, wherein 65535 was the maximum port that was permissible. And again, we get the error message, port out of range. I think this is all the use cases that we can build from server.port property, and this becomes an important point of our application, wherein this is the property that is pre-configured for us, but there are still configurations that you can do with this property. And you know how to play around with this property, what are the different use cases of it, and how actually to use this property to the best possible use. Think that's all for today's session. Thank you for joining.